Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting a hanging lantern and sunset with fireflies around. I've been getting a lot of requests for more sceneries or landscapes, and CAD also requested a while ago to do some small glowy things like glowing bugs, so here I also added the fireflies, and on top of that I've also been getting a lot of Halloween requests, and since I don't really like drawing or painting scary or spooky things, I guess the colors here are somewhat relevant, so I guess this painting will cover those three aspects. Before we dive too deep into this, I did promise you guys that I will feature your works from my 100k video, and you'll see this at the end of this tutorial, so stay tuned. Getting back into the drawing, like usual, I started by drawing out the outline. This time I'm just going to draw the focal points, which are the hanging lantern and also the main branches. For this, I used a reference image that I'll link in the description box, and I'll also put it on the bottom left here. I used the reference mostly for the lantern and the composition, and I also made some other interpretations myself. Even though the lantern just looks like a silhouette from the photo, I always try to figure out the connecting lines between those ends of the silhouette so we can get a better imagery of the shape itself, and it's always easier to break it down into smaller, simpler shapes. I can't really describe every single shape, but hopefully from watching me draw this out, you'll be able to understand. On top of the lantern, I'm also going to draw out a few of the main branches. I'm not going to draw every single shape and every single small line. Instead, I'm just going to draw out some jagged lines to indicate the placement, especially for the main branch where the lantern is hung from. Next, I'm going to mask the sides of my paper. I actually made a mistake here. If you're using the same size and paper weight as I did, I would suggest for you to mask a bit more, but I'll get into more details about this mistake later in the video. For the colors, I'll be using my Pentel watercolors. I like the vibrancy and the fact that this is probably more accessible for most of you, and here are the list of colors I'll be using for this painting. Firstly, here I have white. You can also use white gouache, but I feel like this white is sufficient for this painting. Then I have black, Prussian blue, ultramarine, sky blue, vermilion, red. Red in this palette is more like a quin red or magenta, whereas vermilion is more like an orangey red. Then I have Naples yellow, lemon yellow, and chrome yellow, which is like an orangey yellow color. Because my paints are dry on my palette, before I start, I like to activate them by spraying some water so I don't have to dig too much with my brush, and you do want to be fairly fast with your colors for this painting. I also want to wet my paper. I just sprayed some water again, but you can also use your brush to spread some clean water on your paper as well. I'm starting with a mixture of vermilion and Naples yellow for the top of the sky, and I want to create something that's a bit more pinkish, so I added more Naples yellow in the mixture. I'm just going to spread this out until about on top of the lantern, and I'm going to move on to the next color by adding some chrome yellow into the same pink to create something that's a bit more orangey, and I'm just going to follow through by painting this under the pink. I also want to add a more vibrant orange, so I ended up just taking the chrome yellow and I painted in the middle of those two colors while it's still wet, so it's still going to blend together. Next, with the gradient, I'm going to follow the orange up with some purple, so I used a mixture of sky blue, a bit of Prussian blue to mute the purple, and also red. I'm using a thin consistency for this because I want to gradually build up to a darker value as I get towards the bottom, and you can really play around with the ratio. Before I made this, I made one that's a bit more blue and a bit more vibrant, whereas this one is a bit more muted, and it'll just give a slightly different feel, so you can play around with the colors a bit. For this next one, I added more Prussian blue, a bit of ultramarine, and also black to darken it. And as I get towards the bottom, I just keep on adding more black, and I also use a darker and thicker consistency to slowly build it up. You can see that those 3 layers are a bit more purple since I mixed in quite a bit of red, but at the bottom, since I want it to be darker and for it to separate, since the purple is already somewhat quite dark, I added more Prussian blue with black and not as much red. After I have the colors down, I'm going to use a hairdryer to dry this because at this point the paper is very wet and warped. I'm going to keep drying it until the paper comes back flat. This is part of the mistake that I made when I was masking. I'm used to drawing smaller landscapes, whereas this is an A5, and with larger paper, painting with wet on wet will make the paper warp so much more, and it would be better to mask more than what I did here because as the paper warped, the masking tape tend to come off a bit, making the paint run off the masked area, whereas I never really had this problem before when I painted smaller. Getting back to this painting, for the second layer, I just added another layer of the same colors to increase the vibrancy, except for the top where I added a thin glaze of sky blue on the orange to slightly muted, so when I add the white splatters at the end, it'll create a better contrast. This photograph has such an interesting composition where the sun is captured inside of the lantern, and for the sun I'm just going to first indicate the placement by using white. To give the glowing effect, I'm going to add some of the pink color from the background, and I'm going to use a fairly thick consistency of this while the white is still wet so it creates a softer gradient. I'm also going to add a bit of yellow inside, and then I'm going to color the rest of the window using the same mixture of the background, but in a slightly thicker consistency, so it's a bit darker than what the background is. At the bottom, I also added some purple because that's what's going to show through from the window of the lantern. After I wait for this to dry, the color is going to lighten again, even though it's still a bit darker than the background, but I'm just going to build up on the colors to give it a bit more vibrancy. Next, I'm going to work on some of the foreground, and for this I used some black, ultramarine blue, and also red to create a muted purple color. And on the left here, I'm just going to place some leaves and branches, and I'm doing this fairly loosely using a medium consistency of that purple. I'm also going to alternate the color by changing up the ratio and adding more ultramarine blue to give it a bit more life. While I wait for the branches and the leaves to dry, I'm going to paint more leaves at the bottom of the page from the left to the right. I'm going to use the same method of angling my brush differently and using different brushes to get the texture, and as for the color, I use some Prussian blue and black to get quite a dark tone to contrast with the sky color. I'm also going to double up on the layer because after this dries, the color usually fades, so I'm going to build it up until I get the value that I'm looking for. Now I'm going to paint a tree on the right hand side using the same muted purple I used on the left. I'm making this one slightly taller and larger than the left, so I have a slightly diagonal composition to follow with the branches. When I'm painting the leaves, I tend to randomize the shapes and give more space in between the leaves as I get towards the edge, and as I get towards the middle, I try to clump them together. This way, the edges will give more of a lighter feel, whereas if the leaves are just too close together without any negative spaces in between, the silhouette will end up looking too heavy and bulky. When the paint starts to settle, I then add more black into the mixture, also in a thicker consistency to paint the insides a bit more. And because the color is now darker, I paint more leaf textures on the insides to create depth in the silhouette. And I'm going to do the same with the one on the left as well. Where the tree on the right is nearing the pink part of the sky, I added a bit of red into the muted purple mixture, so the edges near the top and some of the sides have a slight reddish glow on the edges. So at this point, I'm quite happy with the background so far, so I'm going to start painting the lantern. At the top, I'm going to start with a maroon color using a mixture of black, Prussian blue, ultramarine blue, and red, and I'm using a fairly thick consistency for this. The plan here is to make the base color of the top part of the lantern more maroon in tone, but as I get towards the bottom of the lantern, I'm going to slowly add more Prussian blue and black into the mixture to give it more of a darker blue tone to suit the sky color in the background. Then in the middle of the lantern, that's where I layer some of the black, just like what I did with the trees. And this is just to create a little bit more definition for those edges. I do this by lining parts of the lantern where it has those ridges or edges and give it a subtle definition to give a little bit of a three-dimensional shape. This way, you're still building interest through the colors from the otherwise flat shape from the reference photo, and hopefully you'll be able to see the subtle change in the dark hue on the lantern from this video. Next, I'll be painting the branches holding the lantern, and because the background where the branches are is more towards the warm palette, I'm going to use the same maroon color mixture which I used for the lantern. I'm going to use a very thick consistency again for this to paint the larger branches. Then I'm going to slowly add the smaller ones branching out. When I'm painting branches, it's always better to draw or paint out jagged lines instead of flowy lines so you get the rough feeling of those branches. It also feels more natural that way. So I try to direct and angle small lines all over the place and add smaller branches from those jutting lines. On top of this, I also try to create a thicker line for the main branch, and I make them smaller as it gets towards the tips. Once I've got the main branches down, I'm going to start adding tiny leaves or berries. I'm not really sure what I painted there, but I just made tiny dots with the tip of my brush, not really thinking about any particular shape. I just like adding those random tiny brush marks along the tip of the branches and sometimes in the middle of those smaller branches. I like to redefine the main branch where the lantern is hanging from by adding a layer of black, and this layer I feel adds a sense of depth, so the main branch looks like it's in the foreground whereas the other branches are placed behind. Next, I added another layer of the same colors for the sun inside the lantern. This ideally should be done before, but it was quite hard to judge how much darker the color inside the lantern should be, so I added more red on top and dark purple at the bottom again just to build up on the value a bit more. Because I've painted the lantern in a thick consistency, if you are painting along, just be very careful with this step to not disturb the black on the lantern so the paint doesn't get reactivated and run across the wet paint. Now here comes the fun part where I added the stars and also some fireflies. For the stars, I just used a very thick consistency of white and splatter at the top of the painting. But as for the fireflies, I splattered using a mixture of white with a touch of lemon yellow, again in a very thick consistency in order to make the colors opaque enough. I do this by tapping my two brushes together, but you can also use other methods, like using a toothbrush and flicking it with your fingers. To avoid the branches and lanterns, I try to cover it using a small piece of paper. I don't mind some splatters on the lanterns and branches, but I don't want too much of it, so it's something that I'd like to control by painting the dots manually. For the fireflies, I added a ring of orange by adding a bit of vermilion to the lemon yellow with a touch of white, and I paint a circle on the outer part of some of the dots, and this is just to suggest a slight glow to those dots. On top of this, I like to also add another layer of just the white in the middle of some of those dots, and this I feel gives an even brighter glow. I understand that this may be tedious to do for some people, but I actually enjoy doing some repetitive painting where I don't really have to think. So just take your time and paint as many or as little as you would like. I didn't do this for all of the dots because I like the mixture of different sizes and slightly different colors for those fireflies. So this is where I took off the masking tape and realized I made a mess of the edges, but don't worry, I'll also include a way of troubleshooting this as well. At first, I just tried to paint white to cover it, which is something that I usually do for smaller accidents, but for something this big, I think that it wasn't effective to hide that amount of paint. And meanwhile, while I still had a lot of thick white paint on my brush, I decided to add another layer of the white to the sun. So again, do this very carefully and avoid the black, but I think I made the right decision because the sun looks much brighter with that additional white. Since painting white just won't do, what I decided was to cut out a frame using the same paper size and thickness and then glue it with white PVA glue to get the now clean border. In fact, I think this ended up looking much neater than just masking the painting. So for this, because I am using 300 GSM paper, which is quite thick, the slight warping is quite hard to fix sometimes because the paper is very sturdy, making it difficult to stick. So I just got a hot iron as additional help to just force the bind. Then for parts which are still open, I added a thin coat of glue using my brush. Then I tried to iron it again until all edges are stuck together very well. So this is the finished painting, and as promised, here are your works that you guys have submitted this month. You guys did so well, and a lot of you even made your own interpretations of the teacup garden, and I hope you guys really enjoyed painting them. I'm glad that you guys decided to take part in this, and thank you for your participations. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys still learned something new despite the mistakes I made. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!